They said the ocean view was priceless, but apparently, mine was worth a war. Mark had spent his life clawing through deadlines, city sirens, and rent that climbed like ivy over every paycheck. So when he finally signed the papers for a charming, weathered beachfront home that overlooked the Pacific, it wasn't just real estate. It was peace, freedom, a chance to finally breathe. But freedom, he would learn, is never something HOA presidents like Donna Whitmore give up without a fight. He hadn't even unpacked the last of the moving boxes when the stairs began curtains, twitching, joggers slowing down as they passed, whispers bleeding from porch to porch. One woman stood in his driveway with the kind of presence that made the air tighten sun hat pulled low, arms folded like she owned the coastline. Mark waved. She did in single quotes T. Still. He smiled. Maybe they were just wary of newcomers, or maybe they hated the fact that his housing like theirs wasn't part of the homeowner association. Either way, it didn't matter. This land was his now, and nothing could touch that until the white envelope showed up. No return address, just the gold embossed logo of the Coastal Ridge Homeowner Association. Violation notice. Apparently, his house violated the aesthetic harmony of the community. They wanted him to repaint it, redesign the landscaping, file a modification request, all within 30 days, or face fines. He laughed, actually laughed. Because the joke was on them. His house was legally outside of HOA jurisdiction. Had been, since the day it was built. The previous owner, an old man named Richard Callahan, had made sure of that. Refused to sign, refused to yield. So Mark ignored the notice. But ignorance didn't stop the envelopes. Each new letter came colder, bolder. They accused him of mailbox violations, unauthorized changes, none of which were true. When he still refused to respond, they escalated. Then came the morning he turned on his tap, and nothing came out. No water. Mark stood there, staring at the dry faucet like it had personally betrayed him. He had paid his bills, had confirmation. When he finally got through to someone at the utility company, they told him off the record that the homeowner association had flagged his account. Pushed for a review, the message was clear: compliance or consequences. But Mark wasn't built for surrender. So he started documenting everything. Cameras on every corner, every letter cataloged, every disruption logged. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to dig. And what he found was rot. The Coastal Ridge HOA had a history, years of fabricated fines, lawsuits, and forced sales. Donna Whitmore didn't just enforce rules. She built empires on them. She had turned the horror into a private kingdom. And now, she wanted Mark's house in it. So when she came knocking again, polite smile, icy voice, he didn't flinch. You're making things difficult for yourself, she said. We could have worked this out. You don't owe me, he replied. Her lips curled. Just slightly. We'll see. The next attack wasn't a letter. It was a lawsuit. Mark opened the door one morning to a process server and a packet of papers that accused him of reducing neighborhood property values, violating community standards, and most bizarre of all, obstructing the ocean view. His ocean view. Daniel Carter, a lawyer who specialized in homeowner association disputes, flipped through the paperwork with a smirk. They're throwing spaghetti at the wall, he said. But this could be fun. Mark didn't smile. He was done playing defense. They wanted to push him out. Fine. He pushed back harder. Daniel filed a motion to dismiss, a countersuit, for harassment, defamation, and property interference. And the two of them got to work. The security footage helped out, so did the paper trail. But what really helped was the tape of Donna herself, standing at the edge of his lawn, measuring things in the dark. They were trying to fabricate evidence, and they'd just walk into their own trap. Mark didn't stop there. He talked to neighbors, quiet ones, scared ones, the ones who avoided eye contact. Some of them had been targeted too, fined into bankruptcy, sued into silence. But Mark, he had the law, and the longer he held the line, the more others began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this HOA could be beaten. Then someone left gravel in his driveway, not just gravel, an entire mound of it, dumped in the night. With traffic cones, his cameras caught it all. The truck, the license plate, and the man in the HOA vest directing the drop. When the police showed up, they shrugged. Probably a mix-up, they said. Mark didn't argue. He sent the footage to Daniel. That same week, someone rerouted his mail. Then someone shut off his power. Then came the anonymous complaint to the zoning board. Every move was deliberate, coordinated, desperate. And when Mark turned on his phone one night to find a photo of his house, taken from inside a car parked across the street, he knew exactly what it was, a threat. He forwarded it to Daniel. "We're past HOA drama," his lawyer said. "This is criminal." The countersuit expanded: identity theft, fraud, criminal harassment. Then Mark went public. He handed everything to a local journalist: every letter, every camera clip, every anonymous note. Within 24 hours, the article hit local HOA under investigation for fraud and harassment. The story exploded. Neighbors who kept quiet finally spoke up. Stories poured out like water through a cracked dam. Donna Whitmore, once untouchable, suddenly refused to comment. And then came the note in Mark's mailbox. No signature, no logo, just one line: "There is an opportunity to resolve this quietly." He read it twice, then threw it in the fire. You can't buy silence from someone who's already paid the price. They watched him, stalked him, weaponized city code against him. But they never expected him to outlast the siege. They never expected him to win. And yet, the board was crumbling. Donna resigned. The HOA tried to settle. Mark gave them conditions instead: refunds, resignations, oversight, no exceptions. And when the final email came, agreeing to it all, Mark didn't cheer. He just stepped out onto his porch, the same porch they claimed root in the view, and sat with the sun sinking behind the waves. He wasn't just home, he was free. He had won. But the ocean was quiet that night in a way that didn't feel like peace. It felt like warning. Mark sat on his porch, arms crossed, watching the moonlight thread across the water. The same view the HOA claimed he was destroying. The same house they tried to absorb, control, and crush him into selling. And now, after months of legal warfare and sleepless nights, they had given in. They agreed to all of it: the refunds, the resignations, the audits. But something in his gut told him it wasn't over. Desperate people don't surrender. They stole, they calculate, they retreat and plan for the next strike. He didn't hear the car pull up that night, didn't see the figure in the shadows, not until the motion light clicked on, revealing a man in a ball cap ducking behind a bush. Mark stood up fast, heart hammering, and walked to the edge of the porch. The man was gone, vanished into the street like smoke. The next morning, he checked the cameras. The figure had lingered for 12 full minutes. Never came close, just watched, then left. He sent the footage to Daniel. "This isn't over," Mark said over the phone. "No," Daniel replied. "But now we use it." The criminal complaints were already filed. The footage of board members trespassing, tampering, dumping gravel. It wasn't just evidence in a civil trial anymore. It was part of a criminal case. The district attorney's office had opened an investigation. Charges were being prepared. And now, someone was stalking the house again. "They're trying to rattle you," Daniel said. "Make you paranoid. Make you slip." Mark tightened his grip on the phone. "Let them try. By week's end, no. Subpoenas have been issued." The HOA's former treasurer, a nervous man named Jim Holloway, had turned over financial records that exposed years of shady payments, dinners, trips, consulting fees routed to shell accounts, some labeled with names, one labeled with Mark's address. They were setting aside funds to fight you before you even responded to their first letter. Daniel explained, "This wasn't spontaneous. They planned this." Mark sat silently, staring at the spreadsheet, his name listed as a contingency threat. They had weaponized the HOA budget to destroy him, and they failed. But the truth cut deeper than any fine or lawsuit. This wasn't just about aesthetics. or zoning, or ocean views. It was a system, or machine designed to punish the defiant, built not to protect a community, but to protect control. And Mark wasn't the only one it had targeted. He started hearing from people he'd never met, neighbors from 2 streets over, former homeowners who had moved away. One was a woman in her 60s who'd lost her house. Her daughter accused her of running an unlicensed daycare just because she babysat her grandkids every weekend. Another man said he had been fined for non-harmonious noise emissions after fixing his truck on a Sunday. The HOA claimed the clanking was disturbing wildlife. They were absurd stories, cruel stories. But they weren't isolated. They were a pattern. Mark created a spreadsheet of his own, logged every person, every complaint, every dollar stolen under the guise of compliance. Daniel reviewed it and nodded. This, he said, is systemic abuse. The next week, they filed a class action motion. The HOA tried to stop it, or what was left of them. A skeleton crew of lawyers clinging to technicalities, claiming they were no longer in power, that the new oversight committee should handle things now. But Daniel wasn't fooled. They don't get to walk away from the damage just because they lost control. He said, there's still accountability, and there was. The class action suit was approved. More victims joined daily. A former board member, guilt-ridden and scared, flipped, turned over emails, recordings, even group chat screenshots from the old leadership. One recording captured Donner Whitmore saying, flat out, "We'll bury him in paper until he sells. He's an infection." Mark played that clip 10 times. He had never even spoken to her twice. To her, he wasn't a person. He was a threat to her order. And that was her fatal mistake. Because Mark wasn't going anywhere. The news caught wind of the class action suit. It was no longer a local curiosity. Now it was national. HOA from hell faces collapse after retaliation scandal. Retired vet sues HOA over oceanfront power abuse. Mark hated the attention, but he welcomed the sunlight. Sunlight made the roaches scatter. The new oversight committee was composed of 3 volunteers, homeowners who'd lived in the neighborhood for years, but had never been part of the HOA's inner circle. They approached Mark, cautious but kind. "We're not here to control," one of them said. "We're here to clean up." Mark listened, watched, reserved judgment. He didn't need them to like him. He just needed them to never become what Donna's regime had been. Still, the threats didn't stop. One night, a rock crashed through his front window. No note, no sound. Just shattered glass and the echo of Cardus. He filed the police report. Again, he installed 2 more cameras. Replaced the glass with shatterproof. Daniel called him that night. "They're panicking," he said. "That's what this is." Desperate gasps. But Mark was past fear. Fear had come and gone and made its home in someone else's bones. He was building something now. Not just a case, not just a win, a standard, a new way forward for neighborhoods like his, where the people live with dignity instead of fear. The lawsuit settled months later. The HOA's insurance company paid out millions to homeowners. The HOA itself dissolved. Permanently. By court order. The judge called an organization that failed its mandate, abused its authority, and committed targeted harm. Mark didn't attend the final hearing. He stood on his porch instead, listening to the ocean that never cared who sat in a boardroom. That night, a neighbor knocked on his door. Someone he hadn't spoken to before. An older man, hands calloused, eyes unsure. "I just wanted to say, thanks," he said. "My wife and we were scared for years. But you didn't back down." Mark nodded once. "You shouldn't have had to be scared," he replied. The man lingered. "Do you ever regret buying here?" he asked quietly. Mark looked out toward the waves. "No," he said. "I regret that it took this much just to live in peace, but I don't regret staying." He meant it. The house wasn't perfect. It needed work. The shingles rattled in storms. The porch creaked like an old man's knees. But it was his. And now, it stood taller than it ever had. Because now, it stood free. He went inside that night and opened the last letter he would ever receive from the HOA. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even official. It was from a former board member, anonymous, just one line, handwritten, "I hope it was worth it." Mark read it, smiled, tossed it in the fireplace. Because it was, every second, every court date, every sleepless night, watching shadows outside his window. It was worth it. Because no one else would have to go through it again. Not here. Not ever. And that, more than money, more than victory, was justice. The silence after a war is never clean. It's heavy, sticky, full of echoes that don't go away just because the noise has stopped. Mark stood in his living room, patching drywall beneath the new window pane. The rock they'd thrown had left a dent just deep enough to remind him. Victory doesn't erase impact, it only ends escalation. The horror was gone, legally dead, dissolved in the most public of humiliations. Local papers printed Donna Whitmore's resignation letter. National outlets broadcast sound bites from his deposition. People he'd never met called him a hero. But Mark didn't feel like one. He felt bruised. You don't claw your way out of months of legal harassment, stalking, and fraud without losing something: sleep, trust, peace. And now that he had everything he fought for, he wasn't sure how to live without looking over his shoulder. He hadn't unpacked the last of his boxes. Months after moving in, the house still had parts of it that felt temporary, rooms that didn't feel like they belonged to anyone yet, half-finished projects, blueprints for renovations rolled up in tubes like they were still waiting for permission. Not from the horror. That fight was over. From himself. He was standing in the kitchen one morning when he heard a soft knock at the front door. Not loud. Cautious. Mark opened it slowly, half expecting another neighbor with an apology or a pie. But it wasn't either. It was a teenage girl, maybe 16. Then, nervous, clutching a folder to her chest. "Hi," she said. "Are you Mark Reynolds?" He nodded, puzzled. "Yeah. Can I help you?" She extended the folder with both hands. "My mom said you might be the only one who'll listen." Inside the folder were scanned documents, HOA violation letters, late fee notices, a foreclosure threat dated 3 years ago. Mark flipped through them, recognizing the font, the seals, the tone, all too familiar. He looked up. "Who's your mom?" "Claire Sims." "We used to live at 19 Coralview." Mark closed the folder. Slowly, Coralview. The house had been sold just last year. He remembered hearing something about the family that used to live there, something vague, a find that spiraled. An argument at a board meeting, and then silence, a for sale sign, a new family moving in like nothing had happened. "They made her sell," the girl said, voice cracking. "Said she owed too much. We didn't even know what half the fines were for." Mark stepped aside. "Come in." They sat in the living room, the windows open to the ocean breeze. Her name was Ellie. Her mom had refused to back down when the HOA started nitpicking her garden fence, a fence that had been there for years. They escalated, daily fines, retroactive notices. By the time Claire realized what was happening, she was tens of thousands in the hole. When she tried to fight it, they threatened to sue. So she sold. Mark listened quietly, jaw tight. "And Ellie?" She wanted her mom's name cleared. That was all. "She's not looking for money," Ellie said. "She just wants people to know she didn't do anything wrong, that she wasn't what they made her out to be." Mark nodded once. "Give me everything you've got," he said. That night, he opened a new file, not for a lawsuit, for a reckoning. He had won his own war. But how many others have been lost in silence? The HOA was dead, but its damage still lingered in the bones of every family had touched. Fines didn't just drain bank accounts, they stained reputations. Legal threats didn't just disrupt finances, they rewrote futures. He knew that firsthand. So the next morning, he reached out to the oversight committee. "I want to launch a formal review," he said. They were hesitant, nervous. But they owed him. Within a week, Mark had full access to historical records digital archives the old board had hidden on encrypted drives, meeting transcripts, internal emails, private notes. He dug for days, and what he found made him sick. The HOA hadn't just targeted him, they had flagged dozens of families as liabilities, blacklisted homes, monitored households with security cameras they'd installed under the pretense of neighborhood watch. There were notes detailing strategies: isolate, increase pressure, issue fines strategically after paydays. Mark printed out the worst of them and taped them to the walls of his study. He circled names, drew lines between patterns, red ink, like connecting veins in a body of corruption. It was a map of abuse, and he was going to expose every inch of it. Daniel joined him, curious. "You're not done?" he asked, eyebrows raised. Mark looked up from his files. "No," he said, "not until every family they hurt is seen." So they organized a community meeting, not an official one, just chairs on Mark's lawn, a folding table, an open mic. At first, only a few people showed up. Claire came, Ellie, an elderly man named Harold who had lost his wife during a legal battle with a whore and blamed the stress. Then more arrived. By sundown, there were over 50. Neighbors who had once avoided him, people who had once whispered about the new guy who caused trouble. Now they were thanking him. Apologizing. Telling their stories. The woman fined for hosting her sister's wedding in her backyard. The man who lost his job after spending weeks in court defending a fence that turned out to be on his own land. The couple forced to repaint their house 3 times because the whore board didn't like the shade of tan. Mark recorded every word. Not for a lawsuit, for a documentary. He reached out to a producer he'd met during the media frenzy. They were already interested. HOA tyranny, one man's fight against suburban corruption. It sounded dramatic, maybe too dramatic. But it was real. And people needed to see it. Daniel raised an eyebrow when Mark told him the plan. "You're really going to stay here?" "Huh?" he asked. Mark looked around at the home he'd fought for, the chipped wood, the humming walls, the sunlight stretching across the kitchen tile. "I didn't win this place just to leave it behind," he said. "I wanted to protect what it means." And what it meant now was legacy. Truth. Healing. The final scene of the documentary was filmed at sunset. Mark sitting on the porch, Ellie next to him, both staring at the horizon. "I used to think peace meant quiet," Mark says in the voiceover. "Now I know peace means justice. And justice means never staying silent again." Fade to black. He didn't ask to be a symbol. But symbols are never asked. They're made, forged in the fire other people start. By the time the documentary premiere online, Mark's inbox had flooded with messages. Some were short, "Just thank you," or "I thought I was alone." Others were pages long, accounts of homeowners across the country, small towns, gated neighborhoods, even retirement villages, echoing the same notes of fear. Silence, retaliation. One man from Nevada wrote, "Your horror was our horror. Same playbook, different zip code." Mark read every word, sometimes twice. He started printing them out, pinning them to a corkboard above his desk. He didn't know why, maybe to remind himself that it mattered, that everything he lost, sleep, peace, normalcy, hadn't been for nothing. But as the story went viral, something shifted. Not just in his town. Nationally. News anchors started using his name. State lawmakers began citing the Reynolds precedent during horror reform debates. His face, tired, sunburned, and shaven, started appearing on screens he didn't control, and that felt dangerous, not because he didn't believe in the cause, but because he never wanted to be the face of anything. He just wanted to be free. But freedom, as he'd learned, was a public act. A storm arrived the night after the documentary passed. 1 million views, not from the ocean, from Washington. A letter, official, stamped. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was launching a review of HOA power structures nationwide. An investigation into misuse of authority, fraudulent enforcement, and unregulated legal harassment. Mark sat on his porch, reading it twice. Then a third time. It wasn't just about his street anymore. It was about the entire country. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He just exhaled, long and slow, and whispered, "It's starting." But movements don't only draw the righteous, they draw opposition. And enemies with quiet mouths, but sharp claws. That same week, a story leaked online, anonymously written, sloppily sourced, accusing Mark of profiting off the chaos, accusing him of fabricating his HOA dispute for clout, manipulating documents, inventing harassment. He laughed when he saw it, until he realized people were sharing it. Thousands of people. Not the ones who knew him, but the ones who didn't want to believe HOA letters could be corrupt. The defenders of power, the loyalists, the ones who think rules matter more than people. Mark opened his front door the next morning to find his mailbox torn open, not vandalized, just ripped wide, as if someone wanted to send a message. No one left a note this time. He replaced the mailbox. Again. Then installed 2 more cameras. Again. Daniel called him that night. "They're coming after your credibility now," his lawyer said. "I know, they can't touch the case, but they're trying to touch public opinion. Let them." Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at his fireplace. The one where he'd burned so many of Donna Whitmore's letters. "They think I care what strangers say about me. I don't. I care what happens next." And what happened next was bigger than even Daniel expected. A state senator requested Mark testify in person. The bill was simple: cap HOA power, mandate transparency, limit fines. But the fight in the chamber was not. Mark sat beneath the spotlight, sweating in his pressed shirt, heart pounding loud enough to drown out his name when the clerk called it. He stood. He didn't read from paper. He didn't have to. "I'm not here because I hate rules," he said. "I'm here because someone used them like a weapon and tried to take my home." Silence. A senator leaned forward. "They." Mark nodded. "A board and HOA. A group of people so convinced they were above accountability. They committed fraud, just to silence one homeowner." Murmurs. He continued. "This isn't about lawn heights or mailbox colors. This is about abuse of power. And right now, there's no real system to stop it." He paused. "I'm lucky. I had a lawyer, cameras, support. But most people don't. Most people lose everything before anyone believes them." By the time he finished, the room was quiet. One senator nodded. Another dabbed at their eyes with a napkin, and the bill passed committee the afternoon. It wasn't a revolution, but it was movement. Real movement. A few days later, Mark received a letter in the mail, handwritten, soft cursive. He opened it with cautious fingers. Inside was a single photograph. A young couple standing in front of a sold sign. Smiling. Happy. Behind them, a house that once belonged to a man named Harold, the man who'd spoken at Mark's long gathering, the man who lost his wife in the chaos and had sworn he'd never trust again. Now he was renting it out to people who'd never known the HOA at all. And on the back of the photo was a note: "Because you didn't back down. Thank you." Mark stared at it for a long time, then taped it to his corkboard, right next to Ellie's folder. But not everyone was thrilled by the collapse of Coastal Ridge. There were whispers now, underground. A small group of homeowners, the former loyalists, were calling for the creation of a new neighborhood council, one with standards, one that could maintain the value of the community. They didn't call it an HOA, but Mark saw it for what it was: a rebirth, a mutation. Control wearing a different mask. He showed the proposal to Daniel. "They can't," his lawyer said, "not without a vote." Not after what happened, but Mark had seen people forget before. Forget pain. Forget fear. Forget what unchecked authority does to good families. He decided he wouldn't wait. He ran for council. Not to control. To protect. The day of the vote, he walked into the meeting room and saw the faces that once glared at him through windows. Some smiled now, some didn't, but they listened. And when the ballots were counted, he won. Not by much. but enough to stop whatever shadows tried to take root again. Mark didn't want power. He wanted memory. He wanted the neighborhood to remember what unchecked hands can do when no one pushes back. And every week after, when the new community meetings were held, open door, no fines, no threats, he sat in the front, notebook open, eyes steady. Just listening. Not leading. Just watching. Because sometimes freedom isn't something you build. It's something you guard. It started again with silence. Not the peaceful kind, the dangerous kind. The kind that shows up just before something breaks. Mark felt it one evening as he walked home from a community meeting. The streets were too quiet, too still. The wind didn't even stir the hedges, and the only sound was his own footsteps. For the first time in months, he felt a prickle on the back of his neck, like someone was watching. He turned, scanning the dusky road behind him. Empty. Still. His instincts wouldn't let go. He got home, locked the door, checked the perimeter on the cameras. Nothing unusual. No motion triggers. No vehicles parked along. But the feeling stayed. And then, over the next few days, things began to shift. A neighbor he used to speak with every morning suddenly stopped waving. An older couple who once thanked him for exposing the horror began walking on the other side of the street. Even Ellie's mom, Claire, pulled her blinds closed when he passed by. At first, he thought he was imagining it, that maybe people were just tired of the press, the changes, the constant attention their neighborhood had been getting since the documentary aired. But on the fourth day, someone slashed his tires. All four. Mark stood in the driveway staring at the flattened rubber, his chest hollow. He didn't even need to check the cameras. The footage showed exactly what he expected. Two figures, faces hidden, hoodies up, moving fast in the early hours of the morning. Efficient, quiet, practiced. He sent it to Daniel. "They're not done," Mark said flatly. Daniel didn't answer for a moment. Then finally, "We knew there would be blowback," Mark exhaled. "This doesn't feel like blowback. This feels like planning." Daniel's voice dropped. "Then you better tighten things up. Don't let them scare you. But don't be stupid either." That night, Mark didn't sleep. He walked the halls of his house instead, turning lights on and off, checking locks twice, 3 times. He thought about Ellie, about the photo from Harold, about every family who now lived in peace because he fought back. But he also thought about Donna Whitmore, because deep down, he knew someone like her didn't vanish into silence. She vanished into shadows, and shadows always find cracks to crawl through. Sure enough, her name resurfaced 2 weeks later. Not in a lawsuit. In a blog post. Anonymous, again. Titled, "The Truth They Won't Tell You About Mark Reynolds." The article accused him of faking documents, paying off officials, rigging the council election. It referenced a confidential former board member and linked to screenshots that had been manipulated to Mark issuing threats. It was all fabricated, but it spread fast. Daniel called him in a fury. "This is libel, you know that, right? We can sue." But Mark wasn't sure anymore. "Then they'll say I'm using the courts to silence them," he said. "That I've become what I thought." Daniel paused. "So what do you want to do?" Mark looked out the window. Wait for what? For them to step into the light. And then they did. A week after the blog post, flyers began appearing on windshields across the neighborhood, folded neatly, printed in glossy color. "Restore Coastal Ridge. Reclaim our community." It was a campaign, a real one, and at the bottom, in faint but unmistakable print, endorsed by Donna Whitmore. She was back, and this time, she wasn't hiding. Mark stared at the flyer in his hands, the paper slick from the morning dew. He felt like he was holding a snake by the neck. She had rebranded, started, gathering support, promised to bring order back. No mention of the lawsuits, no mention of the investigations, just vague lines about vision, leadership, and restoring property values. She called it a neighborhood initiative, not an HOA. But the bones were the same, and now, some of his neighbors, his allies, were considering it. The pendulum was swinging back, too far, Mark walked door to door that afternoon, calmly knocking, speaking, explaining. "She's manipulating again," he told one man. "This isn't about standards. It's about control." The man nodded politely, but Mark could see it in his eyes. Doubt, fear, maybe even fatigue. People didn't want to fight anymore. They just wanted quiet, even if it meant surrender, even if it meant inviting the past back in. Mark returned home feeling like the ground was shifting beneath him. He wasn't just fighting Donner anymore. He was fighting people's memories, their comfort with the old way, their yearning for order even if it came at a price. Daniel met him that night with news. "She's found a legal loophole," he said. "She's not calling it an HOA, but if enough people sign on, they can still enforce rules, not through fines but through shared property deeds. It's sneaky, but it's possible." Mark closed his eyes. How many signatures does she need? 30. He already knew how many houses were in the neighborhood. 70 to all she needed was less than half. If she got them, she could start making rules again, voluntary at first, then pressured through contracts, then, just like before, "Can we stop her?" Mark asked. Daniel nodded. "But it'll be a hard sell. People are tired." "Mark, she's offering peace. You're offering resistance." Mark clenched his jaw. "I'm offering freedom." "Yeah," Daniel said softly. "But freedom's loud." She's whispering comfort. That night, Mark did something he hadn't done in a long time. He wrote. He sat at his kitchen table, poured a glass of water, and typed a letter. A personal one. No slogans, no warnings, just the truth. He told them what he'd been through, what others had lost. He didn't accuse. He remembered. He reminded. He walked house to house the next morning and handed out every letter himself. No media. No campaign. Just a man and a truth. Some people didn't answer the door. Some did, and just nodded. But some took the paper in both hands, read it then and there, and looked at him like they'd just come out of a fog. By sunset, he wasn't sure if it had worked. But the next morning, he found something in his mailbox. A single envelope. Inside, a list. 25 names, signatures crossed out, withdrawn from Donna's initiative, and scribbled at the bottom, in messy pen, "Not again." Mark smiled. The storm hadn't passed, but for now, the winds had shifted, and he was still standing. You don't win a war and stay unchanged. And Mark was starting to feel the weight of that truth in his bones. The names scratched off Donna's petition list had bought him time. But time was not safety. It was borrowed, fragile, and rapidly thinning. He knew Donna, knew how she operated. Charm first, pressure second, retaliation third. And if charm had failed, pressure was coming. It started quietly. A rumor about Mark refusing to allow his precious ocean view to be used for a neighborhood charity fair. He hadn't even heard of the event, but the whispers grew fast. Then, someone made an anonymous post in the community forum. A carefully planted accusation that Mark was tracking his neighbors with his home security system and using facial recognition to build a loyalty list. It was so absurd it made him laugh. Until the next morning, when someone egged his house, dozens of yolks, every window, every corner of the porch. It dried fast in the sun and clung like glue. The police arrived, but they didn't seem eager to investigate. One officer, young and stiff, tapped his notepad and said, "You know, sometimes when people get too involved in neighborhood drama, things escalate." Mark stared at him. "Are you suggesting I caused this?" The officer didn't answer, just shrugged. Mark cleaned it up himself, alone, for hours. Not one neighbor offered help, not even the ones who had once hugged him during their lawsuits, or shared coffee on his porch while telling him how grateful they were. Gratitude, it seemed, had an expiration date. That night, he found himself staring at his own reflection in the porch glass. Tired, hollow-eyed, older than he remembered being. He had fought so hard to protect this place, these people. But the more he gave, the more they seemed to drift, and for the first time since this began, He asked himself something he hadn't dared before. Is it worth it anymore? He went back inside, sat down in the quiet. Then his phone lit up. Unknown number, no name. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Hello, woman's voice, soft but familiar. I didn't expect you to pick up, she said. His spine straightened. Donna. She didn't deny it. I thought it was time we talked directly, she said. Mark didn't say a word. You can keep fighting, she continued, her tone syrupy smooth. But you're fighting against gravity. People want order, they want consistency, they want to know someone's in charge. They don't want you, Mark said flatly. Donna chuckled. Oh, they will, they just need to forget you a little more. He clenched his jaw. She kept going. Here's the deal, Mark. Walk away. Let the new initiative pass. You can keep your house, your peace. We'll even let you keep your seat on the council. A figurehead, a nice little nod to what you were, and, if I don't? The pause was long. Then I show them who you really are. The call disconnected. Mark stared at the phone in disbelief. Not because she'd threatened him. That part was predictable. But because of what she'd said. Who you really are? That wasn't random. That was intentional. And deeply personal. He opened his old files. The ones from his first battles with the whore. The evidence folder. The witness statements. And there, tucked in a section he hadn't looked at in months, was the answer, years ago. In a custody battle he thought was sealed forever, Mark had lost temporary access to his son for 3 months. Not because of abuse, not because of neglect, because he took on too much work, bills, grief after losing his wife, and missed mandated visitation check-ins. He hadn't told anyone, not even Daniel. The court had restored everything, fully cleared, sealed, but someone had found it. Donna. Mark's single quotes as hands trembled as he stared at the file. It was old pain, quiet pain, and it had nothing to do with this war. But now, it was ammunition. He called Daniel. She's threatening to leak something personal, Mark said, unrelated to any of this. Daniel's tone dropped to steel. Do not give in. She'll make it sound like I'm unstable, like I'm dangerous. You know the truth. That's what matters. Mark swallowed hard. Do they? Daniel hesitated. Some will, some won't. But either way, you can't let her rewrite your story. That night, Mark made a decision. He called a local reporter, the same one who first covered his HOA battle months ago. I want to tell you something, he said. What kind of something? The kind most people hide. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told her everything. About the custody case, about the loss, the mistakes, the guilt, the recovery. And then he told her why it mattered. Because if Donna Whitmore is willing to use this against me, he said, then she'll use anything against anyone. He expected the story to backfire. But a did in single quotes T. Instead, it struck a nerve. Readers flooded the comments, not with judgment, but with recognition. One woman wrote, my ex tried to use my depression to take our kids. I see you. I believe you. Another. This isn't about HOA letters anymore. This is about power used to silence people who've already been through hell. Within 48 hours, Donna's credibility cracked. A former board member released a statement confirming she had accessed sealed court files through an unnamed legal assistant. An ethics complaint was filed, and just like that, her campaign faltered. The signs disappeared. The blog post vanished. Her name started fading again. But the victory didn't taste sweet this time. Mark stood on the beach 2 nights later, barefoot in the cold sand, staring out at the endless dark. He had laid his whole soul bare, and while the world had accepted it, he wasn't sure he had. Was it worth it? All of it? He didn't know yet. But then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. It was Ellie, quiet, steady. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him. After a moment, she said, I saw your interview. He nodded. Yeah, I think my dad would have done what you did if he'd still been around. Mark turned, surprised. I didn't know. He passed before the horror forced us out. But I remember. He used to say that the truth doesn't save you, it just makes you braver. Mark looked back at the sea. He was right. They stood in silence for a long time. Not the dangerous kind, the healing kind, the kind that only comes when the storm has passed and left you standing. The strange thing about peace is how quickly it can feel unfamiliar. Mark had almost grown used to the chaos, legal filings, late-night threats, anonymous notes. But now, with Donna silent and her campaign gone, the neighborhood finally felt still. The air had changed. People had returned to small talk. Front yards were blooming again. For once, no one whispered when he passed by. But peace, Mark knew, was deceptive. It had weight, stillness that pressed down to hard, like the moment just before a glass falls off a counter and shatters. Because beneath that stillness, something was building. And it wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from inside the council. Mark first noticed the shift during a regular community review meeting. The agenda had been routine permit approvals, traffic calming proposals, letting complaints. But midway through, council member Todd Halper stood up. Todd had always been quiet, agreeable, the kind of man who nodded a lot and didn't challenge much, a retired accountant who volunteered because he liked numbers and order. But this time, Todd wasn't quiet. He cleared his throat and tapped the mic. "I'd like to propose a vote," he said, "to reinstate selective community code enforcement for properties in violation of public visual standards." Mark blinked. "What code enforcement?" he asked slowly. "We dissolved the HOA." "It's not an HOA," Todd replied, too quickly. "It's a limited use municipal review committee. Advisory only." Mark stared at him. "Backed by what authority?" Todd's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're drafting the framework. It's already been reviewed by a private compliance consultant." Mark's pulse ticked up. "Who?" Todd hesitated. Mark leaned forward. "Who, Todd?" Todd folded his hands. "Whitmore and Associates." The room went silent. Mark felt heat rise in his chest. Donna, not directly, but through a loophole, a consulting group she had formed 2 months after resigning from the HOA. A rebrand, a mask, a way back and without stepping into the light. And Todd had let her in. He wasn't the only one. By the end of the meeting, 3 of the 7 council members had quietly voiced support for the review committee. It wasn't an HOA, but it walked like one, talked like one, and the signatures they were collecting, opt-in agreements disguised as community surveys. Mark left the meeting with his jaw clenched and his fingers trembling. They were trying again, not with control, but with legitimacy. He called Daniel the next morning. "They're using my own counsel to rebuild it." Daniel exhaled. "That's the danger of peace. It lulls everyone. Makes the next invasion feel like a welcome guest." Mark looked out the window. "They think if they change the name, we won't notice." Daniel's voice sharpened. "What are you going to do?" Mark didn't answer right away. Because this wasn't a war he could fight with exposure. Donna wasn't breaking laws this time. She was bending them. Opting the very structure Mark had fought to protect. He spent the next 2 days combing through municipal statutes, deed codes, land use exemptions. He built charts, mapped names, followed every link in Whitmore and Associates LLC registration. And then he found it, a hidden contract. Todd had authorized a consulting agreement backdated 3 weeks before the council even voted to discuss it. It promised Whitmore's group a percentage of any recovered community value penalties. In short, profit from every flag, complaint, warning, and review. Mark called an emergency session. The vote was tight. 3 against him, 3 for him. It came down to Councilwoman Nancy Park, a woman who had once wept while describing the fines Donna had issued for a single dandelion in her yard. Nancy looked torn. Her hand shook. "Mark," she said, "they're saying this won't be like last time." He looked her dead in the eye. "Does that sound like Donna to you?" The room held its breath. Nancy closed her eyes. "No," she whispered. "She voted with him. The contract was voided." Todd exploded. "You're ruining progress," he snapped, slamming a file on the desk. "No," Mark said calmly, "I'm protecting The people who forgot what control feels like until it's too late. Todd resigned the next day, but not before mailing a letter to every homeowner in the neighborhood. In it, he blamed Mark for obstructing growth, sabotaging modernization, and worst of all, gaslighting the community into paranoia. Mark read it alone in his kitchen. He didn't speak. He just folded the letter and slid it into his drawer of lies. That night, Ellie knocked on his door. She looked nervous. "I thought you should see this," she said, handing him a tablet. It was a website. Polished, branded. Titled, Coastal Unity. Reclaiming Our Future, a newsletter, updates, videos, even testimonies. And in the corner small, almost invisible, was the name D. Whitmore. Founder. Mark clicked play on the first video. It was done a clean, kifed, professional. "My goal is not to control," she said. "It's to empower, to help neighborhoods heal from the trauma of lawlessness. People like Mark Reynolds mean well, but chaos follows men who cannot lead." Ellie said nothing. She didn't have to. The war wasn't over. It had just changed. Faces. Mark stared at the screen, eyes dark. Then he turned to her. "Then it's time I stop playing defense." He held a community meeting the next day, not in the office. On his front lawn. He told the truth again. About the council infiltration. About Todd's deal. About Whitmore's rebranding. Neighbors watched, listened. Some were shocked. Some looked away. But a few stepped forward. Including Nancy. "I vote we formalize protections," she said. "What kind?" someone asked. Mark stood tall. "No individual or group under any name can form governing bodies, issue property evaluations, or impose community standards without full public vote and a legal audit." Silence. Then slow nods. Hands raised. They passed it unanimously. No more loopholes. No more shadows. If Donna wanted to come back, she'd have to do it in full daylight, with a vote, with transparency, with consent. And Mark would be standing at the gate. The next morning, he woke up to another envelope on his porch. No return address. Inside was a single card. Black. Embossed. A quote. "Power never leaves quietly. It waits. No name. No threat. Just a reminder." Mark folded it and pinned it to his wall. A new chapter was coming. But so was he. The past has a strange way of waiting for you. Sometimes quietly. Sometimes just loud enough to make sure you never really forget. Mark stood on the porch that morning, coffee in hand, watching the ocean roll its endless rhythm. The card from Donner still hung on his corkboard inside, the black one that whispered, "Power never leaves quietly." He knew it was true. But he also knew something else. Power only wins when people stop watching. And Mark was wide awake. The neighborhood had settled for now. The motion sensors had gone quiet. The council meetings were shorter, friendlier. Children had started riding bikes down the cul-de-sac again without worried glances from their parents. Even Ellie's mother had invited Mark for dinner, a gesture that felt like something breaking open again. It felt like healing. But Mark wasn't naive enough to mistake that for the end. He'd spent the last 3 months drafting a document he hadn't shared with anyone yet. Not Daniel. Not the council. Not even Ellie. He called it the Reynolds Charter. And it wasn't just a piece of policy. It was a safeguard. A set of legally binding guidelines, drafted with municipal experts, that outlined every limit, every barrier, every safeguarder neighborhood needed to ensure no entity, her or otherwise, could ever claim power in secret again. It wasn't about preventing structure, it was about preventing silence. It required transparency for any vote, forced regular leadership rotation, outlawed proxy fines, and, most importantly, mandated quarterly public audits of any collective funds. Mark didn't want to be remembered for fighting. He wanted to be remembered for what came after the fight. So the night before the annual town hall, he printed 40 copies. He didn't sleep much. The town hall wasn't held on his lawn this time. It had grown too big. They used the rec center off Harbor Drive, the one that had once hosted Donna's HOA banquets. This time, It was standing room only. When Mark stepped to the microphone, the room fell quiet. Not just out of politeness, out of memory, because the last time he'd stood before this many neighbors, half of them had doubted him. Now, they leaned in. He unfolded the charter. "This isn't about me," he said softly. "It's not even about what we've been through. It's about who we want to be now." He explained it, clause by clause, each one forged from a scar, each one a story in itself. When he finished, he looked out over the crowd. "I don't want a title," he said. "I don't want credit. But I don't want silence to win again." He paused. "Vote for this, and we make sure the next donor doesn't even get a chance to whisper." There was no applause. Not at first. Just silence. And then a single hand went up. Nancy. Followed by another. Then 20 more. Then all of them. They passed it unanimously. That night, Mark walked home under the stars, the final page of the charter, folded in his pocket like a shield. He'd done it. But fate, it seemed, had saved one last twist. 3 days later, Mark received a phone call. It was the sheriff's office. A body had been discovered in a rental property 2 counties north. Donna Whitmore. Cause of death undetermined. Foul play was being investigated, but rumors flew faster than evidence. Some said it was overdose. Some said she fled from debts, lawsuits, and finally cracked. Others whispered darker things about the people she hurt, the enemies she made, and whether someone had returned the favor. Mark didn't speak to reporters when the news broke. He didn't speculate. He didn't celebrate. He just sat on his porch that night and stared at the sea until the sun came up. Some people flew loudly. Others just vanished. A week later, a box arrived at his doorstep. No. Just a return label from Whitmore Holdings. Inside, 2 binders. One full of contracts, blank, unsigned, the other full of letters. Letters from homeowners, some old, some new, many, unopened. All addressed to Donna. Mark read them slowly. People begging for extensions, for mercy, for forgiveness. For understanding. He didn't know why they'd been sent to him. Maybe someone wanted him to see the full weight of what power, left unchecked, had done. Maybe someone thought he needed closure. He didn't. But he kept the binders. Because memory matters, and so does truth. The neighborhood began changing in small, quiet ways. People started meeting more often, not just when problems came up. Yards were judged by effort, not aesthetic. Letters were signed with first names, not threats. One afternoon, Ellie's younger brother knocked on Mark's door, holding a homemade flyer. It was for a thank you barbecue. Mark smiled. "Who's it for?" The boy shrugged. "Everyone." That Sunday, the whole block came. No one talked about Donna. No one needed to. Her absence said enough. That night, as the fire pit burned low and kids chased fireflies across the lawn, Mark stepped away for a moment, stood alone. Ellie joined him, holding 2 mugs of hot cider. "You know," she said, "for someone who never wanted attention, you changed a lot of lives." Mark chuckled softly. "I didn't change them. I just refused to be quiet." She tilted her head. "Same thing, isn't it?" He thought about that. And then nodded. A gust of wind lifted the edges of the charter pinned to his fridge. He looked back toward the house, toward the neighbors, the kids, the laughter. And he realized something he'd been so afraid of becoming: a symbol. But maybe symbols aren't always about the fight. Sometimes they're about what's possible after it.